In today's Farm Report, planting season is underway and seed depth can be critical. Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office shares the ideal or optimal depths for small grains.
I talked recently about evaluating small grain stands based on information provided by U of M Extension Specialist Joachim Wiersma. Wiersma also wrote an article last week titled, "How Deep Do I Dare Plant Wheat, Barley, and Oats to Find Moisture?" I know some people are moving now from small grains to corn. Some of these concepts apply to corn as well as small grains. So for today, here's some of what Wiersma had to offer. Ideally, we like to seed wheat, barley, and oats at 1.5 to 2 inches of depth. The goal is to put seed deep enough to have adequate moisture and to develop a good root system, yet shallow enough to emerge quickly. Seeds too close to the surface might absorb moisture but die in dry soil conditions. Deeper seeding can reduce stand density and plant vigor because of the inability of the coleoptile to reach the surface. Dry conditions on some farms raise planting depth questions. We may need to consider the crop, the variety, and soil type and conditions. On average, oats is the most tolerant to planting deeper than the optimum 1.5 to 2 inches, while barley is the least tolerant. The stem of grass plants have joints in them we call nodes. The length of the stem between the joints is called internodes. Growth occurs with the elongation of the internode stem. There are nodes or joints on the root also. The coleoptile grows up from the seed. Eventually the seed leaf pushes through the surface. At some point between the seed and the soil surface, a node develops on the coleoptile that becomes the crown of the plant. A second set of roots grows from this crown and becomes the main root system for the plant. Shoots also grow from this crown that become tillers that are extra stems that can produce grain. The development of the crown is affected by planting depth, so planting too shallow can reduce the plant's ability to tiller, and that in turn reduces yield potential. Planting too shallow can also affect the development of secondary roots that are really the main roots for the plant. Oats has more capacity to elongate and get through the soil than wheat or barley. Technically, oats could be planted as deep as 4 inches and emerge with suitable soil conditions. The average plant height of varieties as reported in the variety trials correlates reasonably well with the length of the coleoptile and can be used as a guide to assess the risk of planting too deep. Taller varieties could be planted a little deeper if need be. Finally, fine-textured soils create more resistance for emerging seedlings than coarser-textured soils, even in the absence of a crust. So you have less leeway with planting seed deeper in finer textured soils. The University of Nebraska suggests the difference might be about 1/2 inch. Bottom line, barley should probably not be seeded much deeper than 2 inches. Many of the semi-dwarf wheat varieties should not be seeded much deeper than 2.5, and oats generally can be seeded as deep as 3 inches without jeopardizing the initial stand if conditions are good. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension. Please consider your health and safety as well as what's good for the crop as you work through the spring planting season.
On Friday, the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service announced 2 more cases of the H5N2 avian influenza in Minnesota. One case was in Stearns County, the other in Candy, Ojai, bringing the number of cases statewide to 26. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the risk posed to humans is low, and no cases of the disease has been detected in humans. Seed depth is important for proper seed placement and root development, especially in corn. Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office has more.
I talked recently about concepts related to planting depth for small grains. The planting depth discussion also caught my attention in a newsletter sent out by Minnesota Extension IPM specialist Bruce Potter from Lamberton last Friday. Bruce wrote, "Do not plant corn shallow in an attempt to get it out of the ground quicker. Temperature and moisture are both more erratic near the soil's surface, and shallow-rooted corn is often challenged later in the season." I'll add from previous discussions about corn planting depth that planting depths of 1.75 to 2 inches are optimal for corn in most situations, and corn can be planted as deep as 2.5 inches under dry conditions to make sure adequate soil moisture is present in the seed zone for germination. We have learned that the idea of planting corn an inch deep in cold soil conditions severely compromises normal root development and creates problems throughout the rest of the growing season. Good root development is important for good use of soil moisture and for good use of soil nutrients. Planting depth is also important for many soil-applied herbicides, and it can be useful to check labels for soil-applied herbicides you are using to be sure about this. 2 inches is a good target. Keep in mind that planting depth is actually the depth of the seed after the soil has had a chance to settle after planting and after some rain. Here's what happens to corn from germination to emergence. The radical root shoot emerges first from the tip end of the kernel. This can occur within 2 to 3 days in warm, moist soil, or as long as 2 weeks in cooler or drier soil. The coleoptile, commonly called a spike, emerges from the embryo side of the kernel within 1 or many days after the radical root shoot. The coleoptile encloses 4 to 5 embryonic leaves that are formed in the seed before grain harvest. The coleoptile might reach the soil surface in 6 to 10 days with good conditions. It could be as long as 2 to 3 weeks. Soon after the coleoptile reaches the surface, the first adventitious roots develop between the seed and the soil surface. These roots become the main roots for the plant. The adventitious roots normally set about 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface. So if we plant too shallow, this can put a squeeze on the space the corn plant needs to have for establishing these roots and additional layers of roots that will develop from the root nodes above the first ones. It can be a good learning experience for children or grown-ups to watch seeds planted in various depths placed against the glass of a jar. Wrap the jar with heavy paper to keep light off the developing seedlings. The paper can be slipped off the jar to see what's happening every day or two. This could be a good 4-H, FFA, or school project. On behalf of our poultry growing neighbors, remember, avian influenza is not a food safety issue. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension, and I hope spring is unfolding at a pace you can keep up with safely.
The 2014 Farm Bill went retro in one regard, relinking conservation compliance certification with crop insurance premium support eligibility. To that end, if you are a producer that has not yet filed out the required certification form, known as an AD 1026, or perhaps need to update that form, well, you have until June 1st to go to your local USDA Service Center and file the form. Farm Service Agency Administrator Val Docini says about conservation compliance certification.
FSA does the eligibility determinations, the Natural Resources Conservation Service does technical determinations, and of course the Risk Management Agency is the entity in charge of federal crop insurance. So we're really approaching this in a Team USDA fashion, trying to make it as easy as we can for our producers around the country.
Producers with an AD 1026 on file by the deadline will be eligible for crop insurance premium support during the 2016 reinsurance year that begins on July 1st of this year. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.